So, a very good evening to all of you. On behalf of the weekly webinar series conducted by IEEE Malabar Subsection in association with IEEE Malabar Hub, I extend a warm welcome to each one of you gathered here for the 84th webinar on the topic Reveal Preference, Learning in Cyber Physical Social Systems from Online Search to Energy Markets. Today, we are honored to have with us Dr. Anup Ephraim, Assistant Professor, Department of EC of NIT Calicut. Dr. Anup was a postdoctoral researcher and Emeritus of Oxford Data Science Fellow in the Machine Learning Group at the University of Oxford during the period June 2018 to March 2020. He received his PhD in Electrical and Computer Engineering from University of British Columbia and was postgraduated in Signal Processing from Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. He did his graduation in Electronics and Communication Engineering from College of Engineering, Trivandrum. His research interests include signal processing, stochastic decision making, and Bayesian machine learning. So with huge respect and admiration, I invite Dr. Anup Ephraim to start over the session. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. Can I just share the screen?
Yes, sir.
Share, okay. So hopefully you should be able to see my screen.
Yeah, it's visible.
All right. Thank you everybody for coming. So today I'll sort of talk about reveal preference learning. And then I'll talk about, first of all, I'll talk about what I mean by cyber physical social systems. And then I'll sort of give two applications, one in online search and other in electricity markets regarding preference learning. So what exactly is cyber physical social systems? I mean, we must have heard about cyber physical systems where you have the physical world, and then you have the cyber world where things, we have the cloud, the Internet of Things, and so on. But because of this popularity of online sites like Facebook, Twitter, Google, and so on, now what happens is there is a lot of interaction happening among users in the cyber world. And this introduces a new element into the cyber physical systems. And that is sort of a generalization of what is traditionally known as cyber physical systems. And that's called as a cyber physical social systems. If we look around, we see a lot of applications of cyber physical social systems. For example, in transportation, for example, you have a Waze application where drivers help each other on the road for better commute. So these are applications where there is interaction in the social world, and those things directly affect what happens in the physical world and of course in the cyber world. Other usual things like environmental monitoring, smart homes, etc. Are finding applications in this new niche cyber physical social systems. So just to be a little bit more concrete, so here is sort of the broad idea of where cyber physical social system sits in terms of how abstract it is and how general it is. For example, it sort of generalizes Internet of Things, cyber physical systems, and cyber physical systems with human in the loop, and so on. Along with abstraction and generalization, we also have a corresponding increase in the data volume. But that's something we will not talk about in this talk. We'll sort of limit ourselves to where we can see in terms of abstraction. Just to be a little bit more concrete, I have taken an example of cyber physical systems with human in the loop and shown below. So if you look carefully, this is sort of the control loop block diagram that we typically see in the textbooks, right? So what human in the loop model tells us that any block that you see either as a sensor, a controller, can be replaced by a human. So definitely a human is much more complicated compared to a sensor, and it involves a lot more processing and computing when a human is involved in this loop compared to a typical dumb sensor. So with that background, I'll sort of talk about, so this talk is divided into two sections. One is, in the first half, I'll talk about what are sort of the classical approaches where you can sort of do learning when you have a human producing some sort of data. And then we will sort of, in the second half, we will talk a bit about the more modern probabilistic approach, and we'll see how ideas from classical theory can be moved into this probabilistic approach, and then some problems associated with this probabilistic approach, and then I'll conclude with some open questions or future work. Okay, so here is a outline of the first part of the talk. So I will first talk about a model for human behavior. So this has been a classical framework, and then I'll talk about one problem associated with an online search or an online social media. We will build a model, and then we will see how we can sort of extend classical ideas for that particular problem. And then in the second part, I'll extend the idea for two more probabilistic models. Okay, so how can we model humans and human behavior, data that is generated by a human behavior? So very sort of classical, I think this sort of idea started with economic theory, where economists wanted to sort of analyze how humans go about purchasing goods for themselves and so on. So this is a very sort of a classical model. So adapted to our engineering setting is what I have shown in the figure. So if you look at the classical setting, then suppose somebody goes to buy something. Let's say you wanted to buy grocery. Each item of the grocery has some price. You go to the shop with sort of a fixed budget, okay, and then you choose items such that your utility or your aim of is achieved. So this model is what I have shown in the first block diagram, where if you sort of generalize that idea, instead of price, we call it probe. Instead of the amount of goods that you buy, we call it response, just so that we are used to engineering terminology. So input is a probe and the output is a response. And this sort of, you have this function u, which is utility. I'll talk about that in a minute. But what the response or the outcome that comes out of u is some maximization, is the output of some maximization function, where you maximize this utility subject to some linear inequality constraints. For example, in the consumer case, P is the price of the goods that you want to buy, X is the amount of goods that you will buy, and then I would be sort of the budget that you go along to purchase these goods. Okay, so what is U? U is sort of the utility function. What does this utility function refer to? So this utility function refers to the preference of the particular human. So what is so important about preference? For example, I might classically I might prefer apples over bananas. So that sort of preferences can be encoded into a function, and that function is what is generally referred to as a utility function. So utility function typically captures the preference of any human behavior. Okay, so that's the model that that exists classically. And if you sort of compare it with a simple sensor, then a typical sensor has only an input and an output. But if you simply compare a human as a sensor, then that doesn't work, because a sensor has a utility function which captures the preference. More importantly, there is sort of this coupling between the input and the output. In this particular case, this is given by a linear constraint, but non-linear constraints are also possible. But for simplicity, we consider this linear coupling constraints between the input and output. This makes it difficult. And what makes it further difficult is the following fact. It is that the utility function, if a human behaves rationally, I'll not define rationally in a very strict sense, but you can see that if a human prefers A to B and he prefers B to C, then it is like, then he would always prefer A to C, right? So this sort of rational constraints give rise to the following structure on the utility function. So these and this structure is given by the following characteristics: is that the utility function should satisfy monotonicity, continuity, and concavity. So if you remember something from our high school economic theory, then monotonicity is also associated with the fact that as humans, we tend to have more and more things. And concavity, the intuition is that as we get more and more of one material, our satisfaction sort of decreases. Initially, our satisfaction increases quite rapidly, and then it sorts of drops down as we get more and more of something. Okay. So this is sort of the framework that we have to work in. Okay. So now suppose we have some data that's available to us in terms of the input-output behavior of a human. Then the idea is that, can we learn something from this data, given that this has come out of a human? So that's given to us. And that learning is referred to as reveal preference learning. Why it is referred to as reveal preference is relatively straightforward, because this data sort of reveals the preference of our human model. So given this data, we can ask several questions. So can we ask the question, is this data coming out of a model that we have discussed before in the slide? Then if the answer to the first question is yes, then we can ask other sort of questions. Can we sort of predict what this predict the future behavior? And then we can also ask, is there any more structure? Can I utilize any more of this, any other structure that I can explain about this human or not? So this area, okay, so this area has been an active area in at least the microeconomic theory. And so there are some classical contributors like Afriet and Varian. I'll talk about the theorems and all in the later part. But the idea is that you don't want to impose any. And the idea is that these theories that was contributed by the economic folks. So they were all non-parametric in the nature, in the sense that they don't assume any functional form of the utility function. They only assume some structure on the utility function and try to estimate a utility function and predict future behavior and so on. So this is a very classical approach, and lately this has found traction in signal processing, AI applications, and so on. For example, there are some application on adversarial signal processing, for example, to detect if in some social media there are spammers and so on. eBay behavior, if some people are just there to increase the price of products. And also this has sort of connections to inverse reinforcement learning and robotic learning from demonstrations and so on. So this has now become quite an active area on learning. So in the inverse reinforcement learning has a different terminology. They say learning rewards, but essentially they are learning utility functions of behavior. Okay. So the reason why we started looking at it is we wanted to see if we can detect changes in physical systems using online search data. And this has been an active area of research. For example, it is easy, I think, there is a very classical paper which says that if you look at queries on the internet regarding fever, cough, and cold, then it is likely that a flu season has hit that particular area. So, and then there are other applications like mining in Twitter, where if a particular tweet has risen in popularity, then it keeps rises in popularity because more and more people find utility in retweeting that particular tweet. So the aim was to build. The importance of these events, these activities, or this data that is generated out of social media is that these are driven by human behavior, and we wanted to see if we can sort of detect non-parametrically such changes in our physical environment using some search data. For that, we sort of needs to adapt the classical framework, and the way we proposed is the following model. We call this the linear perturbation model. So initially there is some utility function that these humans are optimizing, but after some time point, an unknown time point, their utility function changes, and we don't allow it to change too much. We restrict it such that the changes are restricted to only linear changes. And this also has some implications in microeconomic theory. This has also connections to microeconomic theory in terms of taste changes and all that has been done before. Okay. We call this initial utility function as the base utility function, and then there is an unknown change point tau, after which the utility function changes by a linear constant. And given this model, given some data that we observe either from social media, we can ask similar sort of questions. Does this data arise from a linear perturbation model? And if so, can we sort of forecast or predict what future behavior holds and so on? If time permits, we'll also look at a statistical problem. What happens if instead of our responses are corrupted by noise. So we don't have clean observations, we have noisy observations. Okay. So this is sort of the main results. This has a flavor, if people have not seen the reveal preference classical theorems. This is the flavor of reveal preference theorems, in the sense that I'll just explain what the theorem does, and then this is that will give you a sense of what we are doing. So the idea is that we can come up with a set of inequalities, linear inequalities, and if these can be generated from data. So given some data, we can come up with this linear set of inequalities. And if these linear set of inequalities have an answer at some time point, I mean, they are feasible at some time point, tau, you can see that the linear inequalities have, it's parameterized by tau. So if these linear sets of inequalities are feasible at any time point tau, then we say that this data has arisen from a linear perturbation model, and the time point and the change point is tau. Okay. And then, so this is quite characteristics of reveal preference theorems, where the feasibility question is answered by a set of linear inequalities. And if these linear inequalities have a solution, then we say that it is consistent either with the linear perturbation model that I discussed 2 slides back, or in the classical framework where you have only one utility function. And once, okay, so I'll not talk about the proof. The proof is sort of straightforward. In this, you only need to so the necessary condition. So this is a necessary as well as a sufficient condition. Proving the necessary condition is really straightforward, but sufficient condition is a bit hard. So I'll skip this. So once we have a particular change point, then we can, so we have proposed a quadratic program which sort of recovers minimum linear coefficients. And once we have these linear coefficients and the change point, then we can recover the base utility function as follows. Okay. So, these results are similar to many classical approaches in the sense that you have a set of linear inequalities which answers the consistency question, and then if you look carefully, the utility functions are estimated as some linear sets of hyperplanes, right? So that's also very classical of reveal preference theory. Right. So this is sort of the first part where we have clean responses. What can we do if our responses are corrupted by noise? One thing we could do is we could take that linear inequalities and say that these inequalities will not be satisfied because there is noise, but we could sort of figure out the minimum slack that we should add to these linear inequalities such that the inequalities are feasible. And once we have the minimum possible slack that we can add, then we can ask a decision problem whether given the slack, can we say that did it really come from a linear perturbation model, or is it just noise that is making this linear inequalities feasible? Okay, so I'll skip the details. It's a bit so the only problem with this approach is that it's computationally a little bit complicated. It has to be done through a bilinear optimization problem. And in comparison to other classical change detection problems, we don't require knowledge of, it is still non-parametric. It doesn't require knowledge of what is the utility function, what is the change point, and so on. So it sort of generalizes many classical change detection problems, but it also has a disadvantage of increased computational complexity. Okay. So I'll briefly talk about this particular data set. So this data set is what's called the Yahoo Data Set. So this is a popular data set where, so this is a 2007 data set where the technologies at that point were listed as stocks. So you have Wi-Fi, WiMAX, iPod, all those things, and in 2007 were listed as stocks. And then some people were asked to play a stock market type simulation game. And then the input to this game was similar to the Google search index that we have right now. So it was a Yahoo search index at that point. And based on what happens in the ground, what other people are searching through the Yahoo search engine, these players traded these stocks, these technology stocks. And then if you look at, so we have taken some data, and we have taken the data of Wi-Fi and WiMAX, and here is the data for I think a month period. So each the top portion are sort of the search index scores, which is the probe in this case, and the bottom ones are the response, which is the stock price at which they were trading. And if you pass it through our classical approaches, then we see that there is no single utility function that captures the behavior that we see. But if you look at a linear perturbation model, then we of course get one change point, and surprisingly, this change point matches with what happens in the real life. That is Intel announcing a WiMAX chip. And if you look at the utility function that was extracted using the procedure that I just showed before, this shows what's called substitution behavior, which essentially means that people are substituting Wi-Fi for WiMAX because these were similar products at that point in time, and they served similar purpose. And because WiMAX chip was announced by Intel, people were sort of substituting WiMAX stocks with Wi-Fi. So such sort of intuition can be gained through this utility function that is extracted out of this learning procedure. Okay, so with that, let me stop the first part. And so we have done, so we have seen how we can approach learning in humans when we consider them as a simple sensor, and we just want to learn the utility of a single sensor. Then the classical approaches are fine. I mean, it is a bit computationally complex, but they does the purpose. But what happens in modern application is you have to take decisions based on the data that is coming out of a human sensor. And in this particular case, we not only need to learn the utilities of that particular human or a set of humans, we also need to get an intuition behind what we didn't learn. Okay, so that is one other point. What have we not learned? And even in the cases where we have learned something, what is the confidence in what we have learned? So what is the uncertainty in the learning procedure, and what is sort of what is not learned currently? So these two things are missing from sort of the classical approach that we just discussed. Okay, so in order to motivate this particular problem, I will sort of talk about this problem, where this is sort of a classical problem, where let's say you are a factory owner. The two questions that any factory owner asks is the following: how much should I produce through my factory, and how to price these products? Okay, in some cases these questions are pretty easy to answer, but in other cases where demand fluctuates, it's not very clear what is the value that the goods that you're producing have on your consumer. These questions are not very easy to answer, right? So in those settings, we need to get a sense of we need to learn the utility of your product from the consumer that is buying your product, and we need to sort of appropriately price this product so that as a factory owner I get maximum sort of profit. Okay, so this sort of goes back to what I said before. I mean, we don't know what we have learned, and we need to characterize what we have not learned, and we need to have also uncertainty or confidence on what we have learned, so that we can set appropriate prices and then sort of get maximum profit. Okay, so just to put down some notation, here is we have D goods. Okay, and the factory owner or the producer is interested to set a price P. Okay, and the consumer comes and buys X quantity. Okay, and the producer gets a revenue of P transpose X. That's the price that's the amount that the consumer spends on his product, minus the cost to make the factory costs that he has to pay. Okay, so that's the revenue of the producer. The consumer solves a similar optimization problem that we have seen before, where this is slightly different from what we have seen before. This is a simpler optimization problem, where the consumer buys something that maximizes his utility minus the cost that he has to pay to get that product. Okay, so now we have two humans who are sort of trying to learn from each other and set appropriate. We need to set an appropriate equilibrium so that the producer maximizes his objective and the consumer also maximizes his objective. Okay, so you can see that this would be formulated in some sort of a game theoretic setting, which I'll talk about in the next slide. Okay. In addition, there are other constraints. The producer may not have full knowledge about the cost that is required to produce every sort of quantity. For example, suppose there is a high demand. He don't know if he can accommodate everything in his one factory or he has to open multiple factories. So there is uncertainty about the cost function that the producer has. Then there might be cases where the producer, this might be, for example, seasonal goods. The producer has a limited window to sell his product. So he has limited instance to change the price. So it's required to learn as soon as possible so that he can set appropriate prices and get maximum sort of revenue. Okay. Okay. So let me see if, okay. So this is can be modeled as what's called a Stackelberg game. I'll talk about the game in a minute, but here are the main assumptions. The assumptions are very similar to what we have seen in the first part of the talk, that the value function, here we call it as value function, but it's essentially a utility function. The utility function is differentiable, monotone, and concave. It's sort of similar to what we have said before. And in this particular case, we also assume one more assumption is that the utility function or the value function is homogeneous with some degree. So this is not a general assumption, but this most value functions or utility functions does satisfy this. So we will assume this going forward. And if you take these two assumptions and try to solve this optimization problem, you have the following, where we will where the price at a particular, the optimal price to set at a particular consumer response is given by the gradient of the value function at that response, and if the producer puts that correct price in, then the revenue that he gets is a function of the value function of the consumer with the constant of the homogeneity degree minus the cost function. Okay, so we did some simplification based on the assumption where we get the revenue function in terms of the value function and the cost function of value function of the consumer and cost function of the producer. And we also know the correct price to set. It is the price corresponding to the gradient of the value function. But the problem is that we don't know the value function of the consumer, so we cannot set the price. So essentially, we need to learn the value function of the consumer and the cost function, because he doesn't know the cost function upfront. Okay, so so we need some model to model these value function and the cost function. And we also have the requirements that this model that we choose should also give us some estimate on uncertainty associated with learning, and should also give uncertainty associated with things that we didn't learn so far. And one sort of good model that we could use is what's called a Gaussian process model. And that's what we will adopt in this talk. So I'll talk about, entire books have been written about Gaussian process, but I'll talk about it in one slide. So Gaussian process is a very sort of modeling framework where if you sample, let's say f is a function that comes from a Gaussian process. If you sample that process, then this eta, that is a sample function at n time points, have a Gaussian distribution. Okay? Since it is a Gaussian distribution, you can characterize this distribution using mean and covariance. Okay? Why is Gaussian process so important? We have due to two reasons. One is we have analytical expression on the mean and variance of our prediction, and this variance gives us an estimate of the uncertainty that is associated with learning framework. So the sigma gives us an uncertainty estimate of the function that we are trying to learn. Okay. Also, more importantly, any linear transformation of a Gaussian process is also a Gaussian process. So that also lends itself to analytical framework. Okay. So this is a sort of a 1-minute introduction to entire books written on Gaussian process. But anyway, so we'll adopt the following framework, and we'll say that we will model the gradient of the Gaussian process, gradient of the value function using a Gaussian process model. But the value function has some structure. In particular, the value function is monotone. What do you mean by monotone? That the gradient should be positive, right? So we will write the gradient of value function as in this form. This is to ensure that the gradient is always positive. Okay, and we will put a model, put a Gaussian process model on H here. What happens if we put a Gaussian process model on H? This is a nonlinear quantity because it is a squared. Okay, so we had to do some approximation. One way we can do the approximation is by a first order Taylor expansion. Okay, so we did a first order Taylor linear approximation. Then it becomes linear, and then we have seen before that linear transformation of a Gaussian process is Gaussian. So the gradient is Gaussian. Okay, so now we have figured out the gradient is a Gaussian process. Now, how do we obtain the value function from its gradient? You can simply do integration. So integration, again, a linear operator. So the value function is also a Gaussian process. So we have it in here. Okay. So for some particular covariance functions of Gaussian process, you can do this analytically. If analytically it is not possible, then we can do some numerical Bayesian type algorithms, which I'll not talk about. But in our work, or in what we have done, we have assumed that we could compute everything analytically. Okay, so with this model, we can build a model for the revenue of the producer entirely using Gaussian process model. Okay. The good point is that once we have a Gaussian process model, we have analytical expressions to predict future behavior, and also it gives an uncertainty estimate using our sigma variance. Right. So the algorithm for the problem that I've discussed before goes like this. Given the data set, you learn the Gaussian process model for the revenue function, and the first step after learning is the producer will decide what is the appropriate quantity to produce given the model on the revenue function. And one way to obtain that is what's called GP, is a upper confidence bound. I'll not go into details, but essentially what it does is it looks not only at what we have learned, but it also looks at uncertainty associated with learning, and it balances what's called exploration and exploitation strategy. So it will try to learn whatever we have not learned, but it'll also try and exploit what we have learned in the model. So, so the producer will decide what is the appropriate production that he should produce such that he get maximum revenue. But his job is to set prices, but prices are given, the optimal prices are given by the gradient of the value function. We have a model for the gradient of value function. So one way is you can do sample, you can sample from that and give it to the producer, consumer, and see how he responds. Okay, and I have hidden a lot of details, but the idea is that once you iterate this loop, you get more and more good estimates of your revenue function, the gradient, the value function, and the cost function. Okay, so I'll probably skip this, but so far I discussed for a particular, when D was 1, there was only one good to be produced, but the idea is sort of extendable when you have multiple goods to be produced. Essentially, you put one Gaussian process on each of the dimensions of the gradient of the value function, and then you can sort of get similar results. So here is some numerical results. we have compared it with the state-of-art algorithm. So state-of-art algorithms doesn't work when there is non-convexities in the cost function of the producer, which really happens in the current supply chain constraints. What we have shown is that our algorithm is much faster and it learns much faster compared to classical approaches using convex optimization. Okay. We also did an experiment where we took electricity data. So this is data from Canadian Power Grid. So Canadian Power Grid has a particular way in which they operate, in the sense that they have prices for two sessions in the sort of the peak hour and the non-peak hour. They also give us the data about the consumption of the electricity consumption across peak hours and non-peak hours. So we took that data and we sort of trained our model. So the idea was to identify what is the optimal price to set so that people use electricity at non-peak hours. So I'll not show the details, but idea was that here also we could see some sort of substitution behavior in the sense that people sort of, as you change prices, people sort of move their consumption from peak hours to non-peak hours. And we have seen that many of the utility functions that we have estimated matches with what is there in the literature, electricity market literature. Okay, so probably, I think since we are running short of time, so we could extend this in many other ways. Especially electricity markets have a typical cycle. So electricity gets, especially in Canada, electricity is more utilized during the winter months compared to summer months. So there is a time nature associated with electricity utilization. So that can also be included in the model using what's called a time varying covariance function of the Gaussian process. Initially, we assumed that we know the homogeneity function factor of the consumer, but that's not really required for the model to work. We could estimate it from the data, and if at all the original value function doesn't satisfy homogeneity constraints, we can get to know that zone in this approach. Okay, and there are also other generalizations where we can extend this to other Stackelberg games. I have not talked about Stackelberg games, but then these are just two-step games where one player takes an action and another player sees that action and takes another action, and so on. So we can generalize it to some extent to general Stackelberg games. Okay, so let me sort of conclude. I have talked about two approaches. One is this classical preference literature, and we sort of saw how online search could be used to reveal things that happen in the physical world. We saw some drawbacks of classical approaches. The more probabilistic approach is much more flexible in terms of modeling, in terms of decision making, and so on. All right, with that, let me sort of conclude. Thank you. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Thank you, sir, for this informative session. So attendees who have any queries related to this topic, you can either directly ask sir or can be written down on the chat box. It will be read out. So anyone?
Okay.
So that attendees can reach out if they have any queries.
Oh, sure. Maybe
Okay.
it's there in my presentation at the very beginning. Right.
Okay.
This is a personal email, but it's fine.
So I think with this, we come to the end of the session. Thank you, sir, for your valuable time and presence. And thank you all participants for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Sir, before you wind up, there's a question from Rahul R, who has asked to explain in layman terms the main application of this field.
Sorry, is there a
So there's a question from Rahul R.
Oh, sure. Okay. Let me sort of see that question. Future applications, main application of the field. So essentially, in social media, I foresee it in many areas, but immediately, for example, in social media, suppose you want to look at distinguishing spammers from non-spammers. You essentially look at their utility functions. If they have a valid utility function, then they are a genuine user. If not, they are a spammer. So that's one sort of application. Essentially, everywhere where humans are involved and you want to sort of distinguish genuine users from non-genuine users, we could use all these techniques. And that is increasingly happening in many areas where the social element is coming in, more interactions are coming in. So we need an approach to sort of segregate users, especially clustering users based on their utility function. So those are sort of the applications that I foresee coming ahead.
Okay, thank you, sir. So anyone else with any questions? Okay.
How you came to this field? Okay. I was working. I mean, during my PhD, I was working with a company that does many social media work, and it is one requirement that they genuinely need tools to distinguish social media. What happens in the social media? How do you distinguish users in social media, and so on and so forth. So that's how I came into the field. But over the years, I think many more are interested.
Anyone else with any questions? Sir, I think that's it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, sir, for your valuable time. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Yeah.